My name is Fernand Auclair, and I am 81 years old, and I am recording this because my sister Odette died in the third week of January, and she was the last person alive who knew the whole of it. The last person I could telephone when the memory pressed too close, and I needed to hear someone say yes, yes, that is how it was. Now there is no one to call. There is only this recorder and the kitchen window and the spruce line at the back of the property, which is where I look when I cannot find the words. I am a retired surveyor. I spent 37 years measuring the land of the northern interior of this province, and I will tell you that a man who measures things for a living learns to trust what he can put a number to, and I can put numbers to everything I am about to tell you. I can give you dates and distances, and the weight of a grown man I helped carry on, canvas stretcher through 2 kilometers of Boreal forest in October. The number is 164 pounds. The man was my great-uncle, Gilles Auclair, and on the 14th of May 1948, he walked into the forest north of the Lac Nomining watershed in the Laurentian Highlands of Quebec, and he did not come out for 41 days. And when he came out, he was not alone. I want to say that correctly because I spent the first 30 years of my life saying it incorrectly or saying nothing at all and getting it wrong in both directions. He was not alone. That is the whole fact of it. The rest is what the fact means, and what it cost, and what it gave back, and I am not certain I will be alive long enough to finish. So I am going to proceed with some efficiency, and trust you to understand what I leave between the lines. I knew Gilles Auclair as an old man. That is important to understand. The events I am describing occurred 3 years before I was born, and I came to them sideways, through my mother's kitchen and my father's careful silences, and through Odette, who was 6 years old in 1948, and who remembered everything the way children remember things they are not supposed to have seen, which is to say, she remembered it with her whole body before she remembered it with her mind. What I know of the beginning, I know from Odette and from Gilles himself, who told me the parts he could bear to tell during the last 4 years of his life, when the secret had grown so large inside him that it required the company of at least one other person to hold. I was 22 when he first spoke to me. I am 81 now. I have held this for 59 years. Gilles was the second-born of 4 brothers. His father, my great-grandfather Honoré Auclair, had run a trap line north of the Nomining through the 1920s and 1930s, and Gilles had grown up on that trap line the way some men grow up on farms, which is to say, the forest was not something he visited, but something he inhabited, something that knew him by the sound of his footstep, and the particular way he moved through undergrowth without disturbing it more than was necessary. He was, when the spring of 1948 began, 33 years old, and he had been married for 4 years to a woman named Hélène Coursol. And Hélène had given birth to 2 children, a son named Théodore who lived, and a daughter born in January of 1948 who did not. The daughter was called Marguerite in the 3 days she breathed, and she was buried in the churchyard of Saint-Gervais before the snow had finished melting, and Gilles dug the grave himself in the frozen ground because the sexton had influenza, and Gilles had said he would not let strangers touch the earth above his daughter. He dug it with a mattock and a spade, and it took him most of a morning, and he never spoke about how long it took. Odette told me this. She was standing behind the church window watching him, because she was 6 and no one had told her not to. Helene did not recover from the birth. That is the plain medical truth of it, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. She did not lose blood in the usual way, and she did not develop the fevers that carried women away in those years. But something in her went out with the child, some interior resource that she had been drawing on all her life, and within 3 weeks, she was thin in a way that her mother recognized and her husband refused to see. And by the middle of March, she was confined to the bed upstairs in the house on the Lac Nomeningi road. And by the 5th of April, she was gone. She was 29 years old. The priest came and said what priests said. The neighbors came and brought what neighbors brought. Gilles sat in the wooden chair beside the cold stove and did not speak for 2 days, and his mother Albertine fed Théodore and washed the dishes and made the beds and did not ask Gilles to do anything at all. And on the morning of the 3rd day, he stood up and went outside and split firewood for 4 hours. And when he came back in, he ate a full plate of food and said that he was going north to run the spring section of his father's old trapline, and he would be back before the ice went out on the lake. He did not come back before the ice went out. He did not come back by the week after that, or the week after that. By June, my great-grandmother Albertine had informed the provincial police, and 2 officers drove up from Montlaurier and took a report, and a search was organized by the men of the community, 11 of them, who spent 4 days in the bush north of the watershed before the black flies drove them out. They found Gilles's lean-to camp intact, and they found his trapline cleaned and stowed, and they found his pack with his food and his tools still in it, which meant he had not gone anywhere voluntarily, or so they thought, and they found his snowshoes hanging from a spruce branch with the leather in good condition, which was strange, because the snow was still a foot deep in the shaded hollows in early May, and a man going anywhere in the northern bush would have wanted his snowshoes. They found no blood. They found no sign of animal attack. They found no note. They found a set of boot prints leaving the camp in a northerly direction, toward the higher ground, where the black spruce thickened into a forest that most men in the community did not know, and some of them had never entered. The search was formally abandoned on the 2nd of June. The provincial registry office noted the disappearance. My great-grandmother Albertine, who was a woman of considerable practicality, began to manage the household on the assumption that she would be doing so indefinitely. And Théodore, who was 3 years old, grew accustomed to sleeping in the room at the top of the stairs, where his grandmother sat each evening in the lamplight and said her rosary in a voice too quiet to hear from the doorway. All of this Odette told me. She lived in the same house that summer. She was 6, and she watched everything, and she remembered. On the 24th of June, which is the Fête de Saint-Jean-Baptiste, and which the people of that community observed, with a bonfire on the lake shore, and a great deal of food and a certain amount of homemade beer, Gilles Auclair walked out of the Boreal forest at the northern edge of his father's old property and stood at the tree line for a long moment before he crossed into the yard. Odette was the one who saw him come out. She had been sent to fetch water from the well at the edge of the property, and she saw him standing at the spruce line in the late afternoon light, and she said, and she told me this 60 years later, with the same precision she must have had as a child. She said he looked like a man who had been somewhere very far away, and was not entirely certain that coming back was what the place required of him. She knew he was Jael's. She recognized the shape of him, the way he stood slightly forward, his weight on the balls of his feet, which was how all the Eau Claire men stood when they were thinking. But something in him was different, and she was 6, and she stood at the well with the bucket in her hands, and she did not call out to him, not at first. She watched him take the measure of the yard and the house and the smoke from the kitchen chimney and the sound of voices from the direction of the lake. And she watched him look back, once, into the dark of the forest behind him, before he crossed the yard and came to her and crouched down and said, in a voice that she described as coming from somewhere very deep and very quiet, he said, "Odette, is your mother inside?" He had lost 23 pounds. My grandfather, who was the eldest Eau Claire brother, and who was also a man who trusted numbers, weighed Gilles on the barn scale 2 days after he came back, and the number was 141 pounds, against 164 at his departure. He was otherwise in good health, which my grandfather found more remarkable than the weight loss, because a man who has been 41 days in the Boreal with whatever he could find or make ought to have showed more damage than Gilles showed. His feet were sound, his hands were sound. He had a healed cut along the left forearm that was 2 weeks old by the look of it, and had been cleaned and treated with something resinous that was not anything my grandfather could name. He was thin, and he was changed in some way that resisted naming, and he would not explain where he had been or what had happened. Not that day, and not for several weeks. What he said, when my grandfather pressed him, was this: "I went a long way north. I am back now. That is all I know how to say right now." My grandfather, whose name was Eugene, was not a man who accepted incomplete answers, but he recognized in his younger brother a quality he had not seen before, and he decided, for reasons he never fully explained to anyone, to wait. He waited. Most of the family waited, not because they did not want to ask, but because asking felt, in a way they could not articulate, like it would break something. So Gilles came back into the household and took up his work and ate his meals and cared for Theodore with a quietness and a thoroughness that his mother observed carefully, and life resumed its shape on the outside, and everyone waited. He told my grandfather in September. It was after the harvest, and the 2 of them were in the barn splitting lath for the following year's construction work, and Gilles put down the froe and sat on a section of log and said, without any preamble, that he needed to tell Eugene something, and he was going to tell it once, and then he was going to need Eugene's help. And my grandfather said, "All right," and sat down across from him, and they sat together in the smell of fresh wood and old hay, and Gilles told him, "I will tell you what Gilles told my grandfather, because my grandfather told my father, and my father told me in the way men from that family told things, which is to say, partially, and in the middle of doing something else, and with the understanding that you were responsible for assembling the whole from the pieces." What he said was that when he left the camp on the morning of the 14th of May, he had not intended to leave. He had woken before dawn with a certainty, the kind that comes not from thought but from the body, that he needed to go further north than the trap line ran. He could not explain the certainty. He could only say that it was not grief, and it was not madness, although he understood that it resembled both from the outside. He went north. He went north for most of a day, following the high ground where the spruce and fir closed over him, and the light came down in columns. And sometime in the late afternoon of that first day, he became aware that he was not alone. He did not see it that first day. He became aware of it, the way you become aware of a change in the weather, which is not through any single sensation, but through an accumulation of small things that your body registers before your mind catches up. The birds went quiet in a pattern he recognized as belonging to something large. The light through the canopy changed in a way that suggested a weight had moved between him and the sun. He heard, far off, a sound that he described as musical, but not like music, a sequence of low tones that repeated and varied in a way that had structure, but not any structure he could name. He stopped walking. He sat down on a fallen spruce and he waited, because he was a man who knew the bush and knew that the correct response to the presence of something very large and unknown was to stop moving and to make your intention clear, which for Gilles meant sitting on a log with his hands visible and his eyes cast slightly down, as he had learned to sit when he was young, and his father was showing him how to wait. Nothing came out of the trees that evening. He made camp in a hollow and built a small fire and ate what he had, which was bannock and dried meat, and some dried apples that Helene had put up the previous fall, and he lay down and slept, and in the night he heard the sound again, closer now, 3 tones that fell in sequence, and then a pause, and then the same 3 tones again. And he lay still and breathed, and did not reach for his rifle. He told my grandfather this deliberately. He said, "I did not reach for the rifle. That was the first decision. I did not know at the time that it was a decision, but I have thought about it many times since, and I believe that was the moment when everything that came afterward became possible." He was in that part of the forest for 11 days before he saw her. I want to be exact here because the exactness was important to Gilles, and he impressed it on my grandfather, and my grandfather impressed it on my father, and my father impressed it on me. 11 days. In those 11 days he extended his camp, improved his shelter, caught fish in the creek to the north of the high ground, and became gradually, through a kind of negotiation that was conducted entirely without language, accustomed to being observed. She moved through the trees at a distance. She was always there when he woke, and always there when he lay down, and sometimes she was close enough that he could hear her breathing, which was slower and deeper than anything he had heard from a living creature, and which calmed him in a way he could not account for. She made the sound sometimes, the 3 tones. He did not know what it meant, and he did not pretend to, but he came to understand that it was not alarm, and it was not warning. And on the 11th morning he woke to find a pile of fish at the entrance to his shelter, cleaned and stacked with a precision that his professional self noted and could not dismiss, and he understood that the negotiation had entered a new phase. She was, when he finally saw her clearly, on the 12th day, in the late afternoon light that came at a low angle through the black spruce. She was tall enough that the top of her head cleared the lowest branches of a mature balsam fir, and Gilles was 5'9", and that balsam was a tree he could not have jumped to reach the lowest branch of. She was dark brown, the color of wet bark, almost black in the shadow and warmer in the slant of light, and she stood with the particular stillness of a living thing that has decided to be seen. Not the frozen stillness of an animal that has been startled, but the chosen stillness of something that is allowing itself to be known. He looked at her for a long time. He told my grandfather that he sat on the ground, which was the most honest response his body had to what it was experiencing, and he sat very still and looked at her, and she stood very still and looked at him. And that was their first real meeting, and it lasted, by his estimate, a long time, and he could not tell you what he thought or felt during it, except that it was not fear. He said, "It was not fear. I want that to be clear. I have thought about it for decades, and I cannot locate anything in that moment that I would name as fear. She was immense, and she was present, and she looked at me with eyes that were dark and deep, and that registered something I can only describe as recognition, as if she had been expecting something approximately like me, and I had finally shown up." He stayed. That is the simplest way to say what happened over the following 30 days, and it is not adequate, but it is the fact on which everything else rests. He stayed in the forest with her. He learnt the range of her movement, the creek, and the ridge, and the eastern slope, where she gathered things he could not identify, and she learned his habits and his schedule, and what he could and could not do in the bush. And there was a period of roughly 2 weeks, by his account, that resembled nothing he had a name for. He said to my grandfather, "There are things that happened in those weeks that I will not describe, because I do not have the language for them, and because they belong to her, and to me and to the forest, and not to any other arrangement of people." My grandfather accepted this. He told my father, who told me, and I have accepted it every day for 59 years. I want to be careful here, because I am an old man, and I know that what I am about to describe will be measured against every story you have ever been told about what is possible and what is not. And I understand that most of those stories were designed by people who had never been north of the Nomineng watershed in May, and I have no patience left in my life for their measuring. What happened in those 41 days was a marriage. I will not use a more cautious word for it. Gilles Auclair, who had buried his daughter and his wife in the same spring, who had gone north into the Boreal, carrying nothing but his grief and his knowledge of the land, and a rifle he never raised at anything, had made a life with a creature he could not name and could not explain and could not stop loving. That is what happened. I am a retired surveyor. I know how to state a fact. He came back because of Theodore. My grandfather understood this immediately when Gilles said it, and I understand it now. A man can give himself entirely to a new life, if there is nothing left of the old one that has a claim on him. But Theodore was 3 years old and had already lost his mother and his sister, and the claim of that child on his father was not something Gilles could outrun in 41 days or 41 years. He told her that he was going back. He told my grandfather that this conversation happened, and that it was a real conversation, even though none of it was in any language he could speak, and that she understood, and that she did not try to stop him, and that she looked at him when it was decided with the same recognition she had shown him at the beginning, and she made the 3-note sound, which was a sound he would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life, and which he could never reproduce for anyone when they asked him to. He came back, and he said nothing about any of it for 3 months. Then he told my grandfather. Then the two of them sat in the barn with the wood and the old hay smell for a very long time, and my grandfather finally said, "What do you need?" And Jill said, "I do not know yet. I will know in the spring." In the spring he went north again. He had made a decision that, I believe, required more courage than anything else he did in his life. More courage than going the first time. More courage than coming back. Because this time, he went knowing everything he was going into and everything he was leaving behind. He went in April, after the ice broke. He was gone for 3 weeks, and he came back and told my grandfather that she was well and that she remembered him and that there was going to be a child. I want to pause here because this is the part of the story that I spent the longest time understanding, and I want to give it the respect it deserves. I am a surveyor. I believe in measurement. I believe in what can be demonstrated. I am also 81 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life in the northern bush, and I have learned, as anyone learns, who spends enough time in the company of the boreal forest, that the forest does not conduct its business according to the categories human beings find convenient, and that the world is more full and more various than any system of thought I have ever encountered. And I will tell you plainly that what Gilles told my grandfather in the spring of 1949 was the truth, because I met the child and I know what I saw. My grandfather's response to this information was, from what I understand, a very long silence. Then he asked a practical question, which was, "What does she need?" And Gilles said he did not know, but that he intended to find out. And he went north 3 times in 1949 and twice in the summer, and what he found was that she needed nothing from him that he knew how to give, which was not a diminishment, but a statement of fact. She was capable, and she was healthy, and she knew the country better than Gilles knew his own kitchen. And the child, when it came in the late summer of 1949, came without difficulty and in the manner appropriate to that forest and that family, and Gilles was there for it. And he told my grandfather afterward that what he witnessed was the most competent and the most quiet birth he had ever been present for, and the child was a son, and the child was large and dark-haired, and was entirely healthy, and Gilles held him for a period of time that he could not quantify, and which he never tried to. He named the boy Henri. She had a name for him that Gilles could not replicate, a variation on the tonal sequence she used, something that lived in a register Gilles's voice could not reach, and so they had 2 names for the same child, which Gilles felt was the correct arrangement for a child who belonged to 2 worlds. Henri, the name means home in the old French sense, and Gilles chose it deliberately. For 7 years he went north in the spring and the fall. This is the period I think about most when I consider what Gilles's life actually was, because it was not a simple thing, and it was not a romantic thing, in the sense that word usually implies, which is to say, it was not uncomplicated or painless or free of cost. Théodore grew up in the house on the Nomening Road with his grandmother, Albertine, and with a father who was present most of the year, and absent in a way that required no explanation, because Eau Claire men had always gone, north in spring and fall. Théodore understood nothing, and suspected nothing, and loved his father in the simple, unexamined way of children who have no reason to look beneath what they are given. Gilles carried this. He told me so directly, in one of the conversations we had when I was in my 20s, and he was in his late 60s, sitting at the kitchen table in the house that was by then his own. And he said, "I carried the weight of what Théodore did not know, and I made my peace with carrying it, because the alternative was to not have Henri, and not having Henri was not something I could have chosen, and remained the person I wished to be." My grandfather, Eugène, was the only person who knew in those early years. This changed in 1953, when Gilles's second brother, my great-uncle Camille, followed Gilles north one spring out of curiosity or concern. Gilles was never certain which, and found the camp on the high ground, and understood enough of what he found there. The 2 sets of fishing tackle, the child's sleeping arrangement, the scale of the marks around the camp, to confront Gilles when he returned to the settlement. Camille was not a man like Eugène. He was louder and less patient, and his first response was an anger that lasted for 2 days. And then something shifted in him, and he asked to meet the boy. And Gilles took him north in July, and Camille met Henri, who was 3 years old, and who looked at Camille with the same dark, attentive eyes that Gilles had described in his mother. And Camille sat down in the forest and looked at this child for a long time and said nothing. And then he said, "He is going to need things, practical things." That was Camille. After that, he was with them. The 3 brothers, Eugène and Gilles and Camille, constructed a way of managing the situation that was not elegant but that held for many years. Gilles visited twice annually. He brought what he could, what was wanted, which was less than you might think. She did not want much that came from below the tree line, and was quite clear about this in the ways she had of being clear. What she wanted was Gilles, and to have him know where his son was growing, and to have Henri understand that there was a world south of the high ground, even if Henri chose to stay north of it. Gilles brought Henri things from Théodore's boyhood, a hand-carved top that had been Théodore's, and then became Henri's, a small bone-handled knife that had been Honoré Auclair's, and that Gilles gave to Henri when the boy was 8 years old, and already taller than any 8-year-old Gilles had ever known. And he brought Henri French words, which Henri absorbed with the same ease he absorbed everything, quickly and without apparent effort, and used only in Gilles's company, and that Gilles understood as a gift more precisely chosen than he deserved. Henri grew. I cannot give you a number for the rate of it with confidence, because what Gilles described and what I later observed were both things outside the range of my professional experience. But I will say that by the time I met Henri, when I was 22 and Henri was 23, and Gilles had brought me north, for the first time after telling me the whole story, Henri was taller than the doorframe of the cabin we had built on the high ground, taller than that by a full head, and he moved through the forest with a quality I can only describe as belonging, the way a river belongs to its channel, without effort or self-consciousness. And when he looked at me, my great-uncle's son, this person who was kin to me, in a way I had no category for, he looked at me with those deep, reflective eyes that Gilles had spent 30 years trying to describe to my grandfather. And I understood immediately, and with my whole body, what Gilles had understood at the first meeting, which was that this was not an encounter between different orders of being, but between 2 people who were recognizing each other. She was there that day. I want to describe her carefully, because I have held this description for 59 years, and I want to get it right. She was standing at the eastern edge of the clearing where we had arrived, and she was in the partial shade of a large balsam, and the light came at an angle through the trees, and caught the brown of her fur where it was warmest, along the upper arm and the shoulder, and she watched me with the same attentive stillness that I had heard described so many times, and that no description had fully prepared me for. She was very tall. She was taller than her son, which means she was substantially taller than anything else I had been in the company of, and her face, which I could see clearly, because she allowed me to see it clearly. Her face was broad and weathered and specific in the way that faces are specific when they belong to an individual rather than a type. And the thing that I could not look away from were her eyes, which were dark and calm, and which looked at me with what I could only name as appraisal, the careful appraisal of a person who is deciding something about you and who is taking the time to decide it correctly. I did not reach for anything. I did not move toward her or away. I stood still with my hands at my sides and let her look, and after a time she made the sound, the three tones, and Gilles beside me exhaled in a way that told me the sound was good. And Henri, who was standing 20 feet to my left, said something in a low register that I could not follow, but that made her look at him briefly, and then back at me, and then she turned and moved through the eastern edge of the clearing, and into the trees, and the trees did not break around her so much as open, and then close again, and she was gone. I thought about that meeting for a long time before I said anything to Gilles about it. He asked me nothing. He was not that kind of man. We ate together that evening in the cabin, and Henri sat with us and ate a great deal and said very little, and the lamp was low, and the spruce were dark outside the one window. And I listened to the forest and thought about what it meant to have met a person who had no name I could pronounce and no history I could trace, and who was more real than most of the people I had known in my 22 years of life. Eventually I said to Gilles, because I had no other way to start, "What do you call her?" And he thought for a moment and said, "Her name is a sound I cannot make. I have always called her, in my own head, by the word the forest seems to call her, which is nothing I can spell. To Theodore, if he ever knew, which he does not, she would be a mystery. To me she is a wife." He said this without defensiveness and without apology, and I believed him, and I have believed him for 59 years. Gilles went north for the last time in the fall of 1978. He was 63 years old, and his knees were not what they had been, and he had told me the previous spring that he thought this would be the last season he could make the walk. He was not wrong. He was gone for 2 weeks, which was longer than his usual fall visit, and when he came back in the way I had seen him come back many times over the years, which is to say quietly and with a quality of sustained attention, as if part of him were still in the forest and would not return immediately. He came to my house rather than his own, because by 1978 his house was the house of an old man, and he preferred my kitchen to his own, and he sat at my table, and I made coffee, and he told me about the visit. He told me that Henri had a family. He told me this plainly, and with the quiet pride of a grandfather who has watched a child become something he is proud of. And he said that Henri's wife, and here he paused and smiled with the good side of his face, and said, his wife, and then continued, that Henri's family included 2 children, both young, and that the eldest was a girl, and that she had looked at Gilles with her grandmother's eyes, which was the same thing Gilles had said about Henri at every age, and that the younger was a boy who was not quite walking yet, but who watched Gilles's movements around the camp with the kind of focused attention that Gilles recognized. And he said that she had seemed well, that she had moved a little more slowly than in her prime, but that she was still herself, still absolutely herself, and that she had allowed him to sit near her on the last evening, as she had never quite done in the early years, and that he had sat with her in the late light without speaking, and that when he left in the morning she had stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at him go, and that she had made the 3 tones once, and that he had stood in the trees and listened until the sound had finished, and then he had walked south. He died in 1984, in February, in the hospital in Mont-Laurier, which was not where he had wanted to be, but where he was. I was with him. Camille was with him. Camille being then 82 years old and in better health than had any right to expect. Gilles died in the early morning, while the window was still dark and the hospital was very quiet. And what he said to me in the last hour, when we had moved beyond the ordinary things people say, he said, "I need you to go in the spring. I need someone to go." I told him I would. I told him I had been going. He said, "I know. I need you to keep going." I said I would keep going, and I meant it, and I did. I went north in the spring of 1984, after the ice broke, and I went every spring and fall for the next 14 years. Henri was there. His wife was there. The children were there, and then grandchildren were there, and the camp on the high ground was no longer a cabin, but a more complex arrangement, built and maintained in ways I could understand, structurally, but not fully account for, integrated into the forest in a way that was not camouflage, but something closer to belonging. I brought things. I brought Henri the things Gilles had always brought, the small, useful objects from the world below the tree line, and I brought Henri news of Théodore and Théodore's children, which Henri received with a quiet interest that I understood as love at a distance, love for people he would never meet, and who did not know he existed, and who were his family nonetheless. I brought Henri news of the world, not much of it and not often, because he did not want much, and what he wanted in small doses, the way you give medicine to someone who needs it, but does not like the taste. She died in the winter of 1994. Henri was there, and his wife was there, and the grandchildren were there, and the forest was around them, which is where she had always been, and I was not there because I did not know until I arrived in the spring and found Henri waiting at the edge of the clearing with the particular quietness of someone who's been sitting with a very large grief for long enough that it had become part of his posture. He told me in the way he had told me things over the years, without unnecessary language, with his eyes cast slightly down in the way his father had taught him. And I stood in the clearing and said nothing for a while. And then I said, she was known by people who loved her. And Henri looked at me with his grandmother's eyes and said nothing, and I understood that he understood that this was the thing I had come to say. I went for the last time in 2002, when I was 51, and my knees were beginning to send me the messages that Gilles's knees had sent him. Henri was 53. His children were adults. I sat with him in the clearing for the last afternoon, and I told him that I did not think I could make the walk next year, and he looked at me for a moment. And then he nodded. And I understood that he had expected this, and that he had thought about what it meant, which was that the connection to the world below the tree line was closing, not all at once, but in the way connections close, through the failure of the individual bodies that maintained them. His father was dead. His grandfather was dead. Now I would not come any more. He was not alone. He had never been alone. But the thread back to Gilles's world, to the house on the Nomining Road, and the barn where Eugene and Gilles had sat with the wood, to the kitchen where my grandfather had told my father in pieces, and my father had told me in pieces, that thread was thinning. I told him what I needed to tell him, which was that the story would be kept. I told him that Odette knew, and that I knew, and that I intended to find a way to say it before I was gone, that preserved what it was, the whole of it, without turning it into something it was not. He listened. When I was done, he stood up, and he looked at me for a long moment, And then he did something I had not expected, which was that he put his hand on my head. The way you put a hand on the head of someone you are blessing or forgiving or acknowledging, briefly, and with great gentleness, and then he walked into the trees on the eastern side of the clearing, and the trees opened for him and closed again. I drove south on the gravel road, with the spruce on both sides, and I did not stop until I reached the Nominee Road, and then I pulled the truck to the shoulder, and I sat there for a while, looking at the dark wall of the Boreal through the windshield. And I thought about Gilge in the spring of 1948, 33 years old, and carrying his grief north into a forest that offered him something he had not known to ask for. I thought about the 14 days before he saw her, and the 11 days before that, and all the accumulated mornings when a man who could have turned around chose not to. I thought about Theodore, who had grown old and died without knowing that he had a brother in the forest, and who had been loved by his father with the full weight of what Gilles was capable of loving, which was considerable. I thought about Henri, who had his grandmother's eyes and his grandfather's way of standing, with his weight on the balls of his feet, and who had built a life in the high country north of the watershed that was complete and full, and bounded by nothing I could measure. Odette has died now. She died in January, and she was the last one who remembered the bonfire on the lakeshore and the child standing behind the church window watching a man dig a grave in the frozen ground. I am the last one who knows the whole of it from beginning to end. I have one more winter in me, maybe two, and then I will not be going anywhere north or south, and the recorder will be turned off, and the kitchen window will show nothing but the spruce at the back of the property, and the story will be in whatever form it takes when it leaves me. Henri is in the forest. His children are in the forest. His grandchildren, whom I have not seen, but whom Henri described to me, in the careful language he used for the things that mattered most to him. His grandchildren are growing north of the high ground, in a country that has no roads and no registry and no procedure capable of containing them. The world is more full than it looks from the Nominee Road. I have known this for 59 years, and it has been, of all the things I have been given to know in my life, the one that has served me best. I am turning off the recorder now. I am leaving this for whoever finds it and knows what to do with it. Gilles went north in 1948, and he came back changed, and he stayed changed, and he loved what he loved without apology for 36 years. And if that is not a life worth the keeping, then I do not know what is.